Previously on X-Men.
Torture. The military and the police using torture. Is it ethically acceptable to torture one person in order to extract information, in order to compel a confession that could save the lives of 100 people? So, typical scenario, still today in 2019, the police or the military are asking themselves whether or not they should torture someone who is a suspected terrorist because there is the possibility that this will reveal information that will save 100 people's lives, that will prevent a terrorist attack. Okay? This is an ethical question. This is a matter of deontology. This is a matter of right and wrong. This is a matter of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So from my perspective, this kind of pleasure-pain calculus, which is the original terms used by John Stuart Mill, this idea of net happiness is totally irrelevant. Okay? Either procedurally torture is correct or incorrect.
Okay, yeah, I think he is making this conflation. So we have to talk a little bit about, ethical theory in general.
You just accused me of making a conflation. Guess what, Aaron? In the rest of the video that follows, you utterly fail to demonstrate that I conflated anything with anything else.
I think, before we do that, though, I think what he's doing is something like this. I think he's saying, I think he's making the following argument. Calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to deontological assessments.
My argument is not that it's irrelevant. My argument is that it's impossible. So we could turn this around and we could summarize your position, Aaron, as being it's relevant to ethics only in as much as it's possible, but oh wait, you actually conceded the point at several different stages in this discussion that you agree with me that it's not possible because we can't know future outcomes, we can't quantify happiness, we definitely can't quantify happiness or pleasure in the same units that we quantify harm being done. Quick example, Vietnam War. Was it justified? Was it a good idea? Was it a good plan to propose the United States invade and conquer Vietnam? Well, if you do this bullshit pleasure-pain calculus, if you look at it from a utilitarian perspective, you would have to compare the unit values of farmers being shot dead in their fields by Apache attack helicopters, helicopters mowing down and massacring civilians. You'd have to quantify that relative to the value of things like democracy and freedom of speech and happiness and pleasure in other vague senses. Sure, wealth versus poverty, the different socioeconomic side effects of having a communist versus capitalist regime. That's real hard to quantify. Even in a situation that extreme, I've never heard anyone seriously suggest that the utilitarian calculus is possible, let alone plausible, let alone philosophically or ethically important, let alone politically useful in determining the rightness or wrongness of the decision to commence the Vietnam War. And why? Two reasons. Let me repeat myself. One, you cannot know the consequences of your actions, and you already conceded this point. You already agreed with me. We're not talking about the situation of a hypothetical time traveler in a science fiction novel who comes back into the past and the future and knows exactly what's going to happen as a result of each action, and therefore can speak to the good and evil, the amount of pleasure and pain generated from each decision made in history. Tons of people began the war in Iraq thinking as soon as the United States had conquered Iraq, there'd be regime change similar to what happened at the end of in Japan at the end of World War II, similar to what happened in the creation of the South Korean democratic regime. That all the Americans would have to do was march, conquer, and then let the local people take over and run their own democracy. That's not what happened in Iraq. That's not what happened in Afghanistan. And that may be incredibly jejune or naive, but an imbecile like George W. Bush really believed it. George W. Bush was surrounded by counselors and advisors who foresaw consequences that turned out to be completely fictional, that from my perspective were irrational, but from their perspective it was rational and made sense. Therefore, a utilitarian-style pleasure-pain calculus is never going to be useful in determining whether or not the United States should invade Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam. It does not work. And the other point that I think you have conceded also is that you can never quantify pleasure. And this is a problem already for John Stuart Mill. What does pleasure mean? In what sense can human enjoyment or felicity ever be compared to palpable physical harm? You never return to the one example that you set out here that you're answering. You're supposedly answering the question of whether or not it can be justified to torture someone to death in order to gain military intelligence. Now, if you could see the future, if you knew for a fact that the military intelligence you'd gain by torturing someone to death would lead to defusing a bomb and saving exactly 10,000 people's lives, that would be different. But you don't know that. You conceded this point. You could torture someone and you could get intelligence that's entirely false. You could torture someone and get intelligence that's truthful but useless. The one thing you know for certain is if you torture someone, you're doing very real harm. And what you're comparing it to is a very unreal and hypothetical benefit. But we have the further fundamental, profound problem that the benefits you're talking about, pleasure and happiness, really are things like the enjoyment human beings find in eating meat. They enjoy eating steak, they enjoy eating beef, and it's very difficult to contrast and compare that enjoyment with any unit value, with any number assigned to it, compared to the ecological harm done, compared to the torment the animal has to endure, so on and so forth. Okay? The question is not whether or not it is relevant or irrelevant to consider utilitarian pleasure-pain calculus in ethics and in politics. The question is whether it's possible or impossible. And you already conceded that I'm right on this, and you agree 90%, if not 100%.
Overall happiness is irrelevant to deontological assessments of the rightness or wrongness of an act.
2,000 years later.
Calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to ethics. So, first thing we need to note is that this argument is invalid. Even if this premise is true, that's not enough to guarantee that this premise is true.
Do you believe we live in a world in which that calculus is possible? Do you believe we live in a world where there is a falsifiable, objectively real number that governments can assign to the value of torturing someone to death? And the government of Switzerland, and the government of the United States, and the government of Canada, and the government of Scotland, and the government of Saudi Arabia, when they do the math, they all come up with the same number. Do you really believe that this calculus exists? Do you really believe that I am in the position of denying the relevance of this calculus to moral, ethical, and political questions? Or are you conceding the point that this calculation, this equation, never has existed? It never has been possible. It never has been useful in political debates, including when different nations debate their policy on torture and extraordinary rendition and what intelligence services do. That in fact, this is only a notion that has existed in the libraries of academic philosophy and in the chalkboards of university classrooms. Do you concede that point or not? I think you do. I think you're just being an asshole. I think you're just trying to impress the audience with your knowledge of textbook philosophy that is completely unrelated to the argument I'm really making. Because you never come back to the fundamental question. You never commit to saying that yes, you believe you should torture a person to death, that yes, you believe you should launch a war on the basis of this kind of imaginary calculus. You never come forward and say that you think there's something real and true and quantifiable and verifiable that's revealed by creating this kind of equation. That this kind of equation is not just an exercise in self-justification. And that's my position. That's what it is. If someone tells you, don't worry about the harm done by opening a new casino, don't worry about the harm done to people's lives by opening a new casino, because I'm confident that the pleasure created by the casino, the value of the entertainment, is greater than the harm being done. There is no way for that claim to be anything other than hollow propaganda. If someone tells you, don't worry about the harm done by torturing people to death, because I'm confident the number of lives saved, the amount of enjoyment, pleasure, the benefits of Western society, the greatness of America, I'm sure that the benefits are quantifiably so much greater. You know it's a lie. You know it must be propaganda. It never can be true, both because the consequences are unknowable and because, as I've said, what you call happiness, what you call pleasure, what you call benefit in these scenarios has no unit. It cannot be counted.
And the reason is that we haven't been told that deontology is the correct theory. There are other theories of how ethics works. So, for example, let's see. Here is Russ Schaefer-Lando's book.
He then rambles on to basically say that he knows the names of some books and some authors, and he makes absolutely zero effort to relate these authors that he's citing to the argument I made or to any of the problems I presented. Like, he doesn't say, oh, and this is relevant to solving the problem of governments committing torture in a democratic society, or governments deciding to build casinos even though they know casinos do real harm, and the benefits of the casino are much more debatable. Like, what is the meaning of happiness and entertainment in the context of gambling? Building a casino is not really comparable to building a sewage treatment plant, but governments elect to do these things. So again, sincerity is a problem, salience is a problem, and he never does back up his claim or his threat that I'm guilty of conflating something. He started this by saying that I was guilty of a conflation error. There was no conflation in my argument. And your argument, it's worse than true or false. It's just irrelevant. The only positive thing I can say about this interaction with Aaron Yarmel, the only positive thing I can say is that it reminds me of the reasons why I'm glad that I haven't been stuck in an academic career for all these years. I'm glad that I'm not in a PhD program right now, because I don't have to put up with morons like you, Aaron. I don't have to be flattering and obsequious towards you. I don't have to treat you as a colleague. I can tell you straight to your face, you're too stupid to play this game. You sound like you're on psych meds. I hope that you are. I hope that you're on neuroleptics. I hope that you're on heavy antidepressants or antipsychotic drugs. I hope, because then you can quit and you can get better. If you're not on psych meds, homie, I'm sorry. You're stuck with this. This is who you are for the rest of your life. Enjoy your PhD, enjoy your MA, enjoy your mysterious charitable foundation you've created for the teaching of public philosophy, because you suck at it. You're a great example of someone who's chosen to focus on your own area of greatest weakness.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.